This is House Planning Help episode 276. Hi there, I'm Ben Adam-Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in self-build, because I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up today, my guests are Roman and Tracey Iwanczuk, and we've got a case study of their project, Hope View Passivhaus. And some interesting aspects to this as well. Firstly, it's one of those special builds, a paragraph 55 as it used to be called. This is where the National Planning Policy Framework allows rural development in exceptional circumstances. So we're going to find out what those were. Also, we talk ground source heat pumps, Tesla power walls, and HEPA filters, which are a new one on me, HEPA filters, to try and filter out some of the smells in your immediate areas. That's something you're thinking about if you're going very airtight with your property. Could this be a nice addition to your MVHR? Firstly, I wanted to mention the Healthy Buildings Conference and Expo. It's the first event of the year for me, and I'm looking forward to that. This is hosted by the Alliance for Sustainable Building Products. And although aimed at building professionals, I always think this is a smart move. If you try and sneak in as a self-builder, yes, you might be the only one there, or maybe only a couple of you there, but you're definitely going to learn something, first of all, as I'm sure all of the attendees will. It's also a great stress-free networking opportunity because no one is really there for that reason, which is why it's very good to meet all these people who are interested in healthy homes, which is really what you want at the heart of every building, isn't it? And then they have their exemplar projects that are going to form part of the ASBP awards. So all of the teams of people who are responsible for delivering these projects, they'll be there too. So that's another reason to get yourself there. It's held every year, the Healthy Buildings Conference and Expo, and I am certainly looking forward to it. We'll put a link in today's show notes. Let's get to our featured interview with Roman and Tracey Iwanczuk, and there's nothing I enjoy more than checking out a new build, hearing some of the stories, some of the highs and lows, and of course, learning from the whole adventure. I started this chat by asking Roman, when had they first thought about building a house?
We used to live in the US, and one of the things that we'd planned to do over there was build our own property. We'd bought a piece of land, we'd got architects' plans, we're almost ready to go. And on the day we went and strung out the lot to work out what was going to look where and do all that kind of stuff, we had the bright idea to move back to the UK after 20 years in the US. And that stopped all of those ideas, and we moved back, and we found it pretty difficult to find a property that would work for us. We ended up with a list of pros and cons for what we wanted from a property, but the place we ended up with didn't tick many of those boxes. But it was light and bright and reasonably warm. The only problem was it was listed 200 plus years old, and I think the itch never really went away. And we kind of realised that if we wanted what we really needed in our home, we'd probably have to build. And so we started looking at different building plots around the area. And nothing we found was particularly appealing, or it was just ridiculously expensive for what it was. And then one day, Tracey was in this field, which we used ostensibly to exercise our dogs. They both need a lot of exercise. And she was kind of frustrated, I suppose, because we'd just been to see yet another property and it wasn't particularly brilliant. And she said to herself, I just want to live here. And all of a sudden it clicked. We've got a 6-acre field. Why don't we try and build in the field that we already own? And we realised it was open countryside and it would be a challenge, but that's really where the idea came, and it rekindled, I think, those ideas of the previous build that we almost did but didn't quite do.
So this is quite interesting because we're talking about paragraph 55 as the legislation that's going to help you, but this has actually changed in recent times. I'm led to believe that actually not that much has changed, so we can talk about that openly. But when you came back to the UK, how did you choose where you're going to go?
We chose this area because we'd come on vacation to the theatre in Malvern, and we love the hills in this area. And really it's those two things that brought us back to this part of the country. Neither of us are from this area. And it really was pretty much just sticking a pin in the map and saying, let's be within half an hour's drive of Malvern Theatre.
What was this like compared to where you were in the States? Is it Roman's laughing. It must be a massive contrast.
It is. We were in Northern California in a ski town. So we had hills around, and that's very important to us. Hills and natural beauty, I think, are quite important to us. Other than that, California was 300 days of blue sky and sunshine and snow the rest of the time. So it's quite different. But, you know, we're both British, so we grew up in this country, and I think having that cultural impact was really important to us to get back to at the time.
What are your first steps then when you think you want to build something on this site? You know it's just presumably agricultural fields. We're not in a village boundary here. So what happens?
The first person we contacted was a planning person. I can't think what the term's called.
Planning consultant?
Thank you, yes. And I emailed him. He just gave an email response back. He didn't even come to the site. He basically looked on Google Maps and said, I give you a 2% chance of being able to achieve this. I'm like, oh, I don't agree with that. So then we contacted a local architect, and he actually came to site and stood in the field and said, I'll give you a 5% chance of building. I'm like, well, it's going up. Exactly. And I didn't really like the architect's work. And so I thought, well, if we're going to build this, we need to do this with integrity, not just try and do it because we can get it done. So I contacted another architect whose work I did like and had him come to site. And he really looked at this landscape and said, he came up with some ideas that the main part of this build that really unlocked this site for us was a big stone facade that we have on the front of the house, which links with other stone walls in this area. And he said, well, you know what, I think it's 50-50. I'm like, this is good, let's go with those odds. And it was a massive leap of faith.
Gamble.
It was a gamble. We're not gamblers, we're very conservative in a lot of ways, but it just felt like the right thing to do. Because a greenfield site isn't always the best use of a piece of land. I love the countryside, and it wouldn't be that without these green fields, but not every piece of land needs to be a perfect greenfield site. With this land being so steep and sloping, it wasn't practical as agricultural land, and a beautiful piece of architecture in it is enhancing it, as a paragraph 55 house should do. It's not detrimental to the site at all.
How does this work then when you're trying to really get the green light? Do you have to follow planning guidelines first, or do you still start with the design, this is what I want, let's see how far we'll go? Because the other thing is that the costs can accrue before anything happens, can't they?
I think the key is to come up with a scheme. It's not about just following planning guidelines. Obviously, that's important, but to come up with an idea for using 6 acres in our case to its best extent. We had a number of factors here. As Tracey pointed out, the sloping site was just not useful as an agricultural field. In fact, the bloke that was born in the farmhouse below told us that this field hadn't really been used in 40 years for anything serious. And so it was a matter of coming up with a way of saying, let's do something that is a benefit for our environment, our area, maybe even the people that live around here, that makes sense. And so we came up with a scheme which was to return about 3 acres of it to natural woodland, to put in an acre of mixed orchard, reflective to a degree as best we could of local orchards. And, by the way, we want to put a house in here. And then the other thing that we did too was some flood prevention measures for the houses below, because we'd lived in the house below. And in 2012, the runoff of water from this field flooded 2 of our neighbours to the point of 2-3 inches of water in their kitchens. And so we did decide to put in some swales and an attenuation pond to come up with a whole scheme that made sense.
And then the architecture really was kind of the last thing on the list. The house, it meets our needs beautifully, and we had also drawn out a kind of a floor plan of what we wanted. And the architect took that, pretty much just bolted on the stone wall for us to fit that, slot that into all of this other scheme, and into its environment.
It's quite unusual, actually, to have that strong idea to begin with. Normally, you're sort of going through the motions of how you're going to live in the house. So how did you come up with such a strong idea to begin with?
The lot is south-facing. We wanted all our main living space to utilise that southern aspect. And we have floor-to-ceiling glazing. It is a beautiful landscape around here, and we want to see that all the time. And so our principal rooms, living, office, bedroom, were all south-facing, and then everything else just kind of got shoved in the back. So it was actually really easy. We knew the room sizes. The house that we were in was an old Georgian house, and the rooms were about 15 foot square, which is a lovely size to a room. And so we really just drew out these 15 foot square boxes and bolted them together.
And in terms of the single story, was that planning or design there, or because, as you say, you've got all your main rooms there?
Happy accident, I suppose. We wanted single story because this was designed as a home to get old in eventually, and we don't need that many rooms, and of course it also fit the site. The house itself is very minimal visibility in the landscape, and we can stand on British Camp, which we can see very clearly from this viewpoint, and when you look back you don't see the house at all. You see the old house that we were in quite clearly, but you just don't see us, and partly because we're single story.
So Roman, how would you describe this house and the makeup, the structure of it?
A brick box.
Concrete box.
Yeah, a concrete box. The biggest structural aspect we had to deal with was retaining a hill. We're built into the hillside. The rear of the property is probably about, well, if you take into account foundations, about 2 metres set into a hillside. And so structural strength was really important. So going for any kind of build that involved wooden frame, that kind of thing, was just a no-no from day one. We knew that we were going to be planting a lot of trees. So in some respects, we felt less guilty about using concrete because we could offset the carbon that way. But really, it literally is a brick box, but not in the classic passive house sense. With passive house, you try and go for a shape that minimises the surface area for a given volume. We needed to go long and thin, so we also knew that in that respect, we had quite a technical challenge. So I say it's a brick box. It's not your classic passive house brick box. It's a long, skinny passive house.
You mentioned those challenges then of the form. What impact does that have? Is it sort of beefing up insulation, things like that?
Actually, we didn't have to do a lot of beefing up insulation. We just had to be really, really careful about air leakage. That was the biggest issue. So we have concrete walls, double thickness, but standard blocks in that they're blocks that are bought from builder's merchant, but they're their heaviest blocks that you can get laid on their side. And then the roof was built off-site. It's effectively concrete planks. And the biggest issue is that you've got a situation where, for example, the rear walls get no sunlight whatsoever, but the roof gets a lot of light and therefore a lot of heat. So you've got different thermal expansion rates between things like roof and walls. And so making sure that there was a decent seal around the sort of top where the roof meets the walls was a bit of a challenge, but we solved that challenge using basically passive house window tape to provide a barrier for airflow that gave us some flexibility at that point to accommodate any thermal expansion. So it was a challenge, but it was a challenge that we eventually worked out how to cope with.
Being built into the hill actually helped our passive house credentials really, because one of our consultants' concerns was with having all this floor-to-ceiling glazing on the southern side.
I was going to mention it at some point. So,
yeah.
And overheating, how we make sure we minimise this.
Yeah, that being built into the hill there, it just helps keep the temperature so even through the building.
Yeah, effectively removes a lot of surface area from the equation. If you think about it, we've got a long, about 30 odd metre wall, of which easily 3/4 of it is buried into a hillside. It's completely removed from any concerns about heat leakage.
So when you say you're built into the hillside, does that mean exporting a lot of spoil, or have you moved it around the site? Or
Yeah, moved it round. Yeah. What we dug out, if you think about creating a flat surface from a hillside, you're removing a big triangular wedge of soil. We just moved that to in front of the house, so that in front of the house we could level off that landscape a bit more, effectively to create what you'd call a ha-ha, but it wasn't envisaged that way to begin with. But the added advantage of doing that was we created a fairly flat spot in front of the house, but also a place to run our ground source heat pipes. So the ground source pipes run horizontally in that spoil that we removed to create the space for the house.
Now, I was mentioning earlier to Tracey that ground source isn't something that I see massively with passive housing. Quite often air source. Sometimes people strip it right back, even with these panel heater these days. So what was behind that decision?
We knew we needed a source of heat. To think that in this environment the passive house alone would do everything we need is a bit of a stretch. I think in retrospect we could have done without it, and the house would have been an okay environment to live in even without any additional form of heating. But as Tracey mentioned earlier, we designed this house to be a house that you can grow old in. And as you grow older, you need more warmth. We envisage that when we're 70, 80, this house will run a lot warmer than it runs now. And so we need some additional source of heating. And we thought, we have the area, we're going to be putting in concrete floors, we might as well run pipes while we're building. It's the kind of thing that you can't easily retrofit. And so for us at that point, we thought ground source made sense to do. The other thing about air source is we'd read a lot about it being reasonably noisy, and we didn't want that. We live in a very, very quiet environment. And we went with a Viessmann product for the ground source heat pump, and our builder was really, really surprised at how quiet that was as a ground source pump. He said that normally with the ground source pumps he's put in the past, he has to build a box around them to stop them from being quite so noisy. And ours, you barely hear it around the house. I mean, when it's kicked in, you hear a bit of a thump as it turns on. But in general, it just hums away in the background. You barely notice it.
What is actually entailed in installing it? You've got to dig this hole. You're talking vertical here. What else happens?
Well, we had a level slope of about, I think at the point where we put it, somewhere in the region of 30 to 40 degrees. And you're going to turn that into a flatter surface. So you're going to flatten off that 30, 40 degree slope. So to a certain degree, you're going to put a lot of spoil on top of an area. So all you needed to do was dig down a trench of about 1.5 meters, I think, really, at its steepest point. But at its shallowest point, nothing, because you were going to put 1 meter and a bit of soil on top of that from what had been removed to make the space for the house. So really, it was just a matter of digging a trench. You had to put down an ash layer to insulate the pipes so they weren't sitting directly on the earth. But also, given that we have a very clay-like soil, give some means for moisture to seep back into that area where you've got the pipes, because you've got to return heat back to the place where you're robbing heat from. And with clay being relatively impervious, you've got to find a way of allowing moisture to seep back through. So that's why you lay down something that's more permeable. But it really was just a matter of running a digger along, digging a trench, and then covering it all over.
So pretty standard stuff. And then you're also using that for your hot water.
Yeah. And realistically, most of our electricity consumption in the winter is used for generating hot water. I would say that somewhere in the region of 80% of the energy that we use is for generating domestic hot water in the winter. Very little is actually used for providing heat using the underfloor heating. We have maybe, in percentage terms, 30%, 35% of the house that runs cooler because it has no direct sun. And that, I think maybe the ground source kicks in to heat that half a dozen times that we really notice it switch on, but barely at all. I'd say most of our use of the ground source is actually to give us domestic hot water.
It is quite energy hungry. It uses a lot of electricity to run a ground source heat pump. I don't think a lot of people realise that.
Yeah.
And that's why we notice our electricity bills increase in the winter, purely because we're using the ground source to heat the hot water. In the summer, we have an immersion in the hot water tank that when we're exporting excess solar power, this little immersion kicks on and heats our hot water for us. So whenever it's sunny, we don't need the ground source, and you really notice the difference in the bills when the weather's not so sunny.
Yeah.
You have quite a large array and a battery pack here, or whatever. I don't know too much about these Tesla. Oh, I'm back to Roman. Okay.
So we have a 30 panel array, gives us just shy of 9 kilowatts of generation capability. There are 2 Tesla Powerwalls, first generation Powerwalls, that feeds. They can store about 14 kilowatts. And in summer, that easily runs the house throughout the night. I mean, the idea of using the batteries was really to time shift our solar. We have no means of exporting power from the batteries. It's not that kind of system. It's purely about storing energy when we have that excess energy during the day to use it in the night. That's why I use the term time shifting. And we also got an extension of the amount that we can export. Western Power allowed us to export 5 kilowatts of power. Normally the limit is something like 3.67. And so when we are generating excess, we can export up to 5 kilowatts of that power. But for the rest of it, the extra 4 odd kilowatts that we have, the only reason to have those panels is on a poor day where we have limited sunlight, to try and charge those batteries up as much as we possibly can, because that's what's going to keep us going through the night.
And I know this is your field, really, electrical engineering. So would you have put in the same sort of system now, or have things drastically moved on?
Yeah, they have moved on. Our battery system is the thing that I would change. When we installed them, batteries were only available easily that sat on the DC side of the system. So effectively, not quite, but effectively directly connected to the solar panels. What that means is that if we have full batteries, let's say, and we have a power cut, we can't use any of that energy that's sitting in those batteries, because there's a danger that we could feed power onto the grid when maybe that power cut is because somebody's working on the grid and it would electrocute them. So the system is designed to completely switch off all the electricity in case of a power cut. The more modern Tesla system works with the batteries sitting on the AC side of the system. Now what that does is allows you to have effectively an automatic switch that will isolate the house in case of a power cut, but still allow the batteries to generate AC voltage to feed the power that they have to the house. So if there is any power outage, then your house becomes effectively an island of electricity, and you can use whatever power is in the batteries. If I was to design the system today, that's the kind of system that I would use. And in fact, we are looking at upgrading the system to do that. It will mean some physical changes with location for the batteries that have to move from where they are now into a garage area, which is close to where our electricity comes into the house. So there's some physical shifting about that we'd need to do. But I don't feel that it's too wasteful, because there's a lot of market for the batteries that we have as a second life use, either for somebody else who wants that kind of system or for reuse in other areas. So I don't feel that it's too wasteful, maybe a little bit.
Let's just rewind on construction and heading into that. Were there any challenges that came up? I know it's probably a couple of years ago now, but...
We've been incredibly lucky. we had a dream of a project in hindsight. When you're going through it, it's
lots of decisions.
It is, lots of decisions, writing those big checks every month. It's tough. But having seen what other people go through in projects, we were so fortunate. And the only issue we had were with the window company and just lots of errors on their side.
So you obviously have some big windows. So how did you get through this challenge?
Perseverance, I think.
It really has only been resolved in the last 6 months. So it's taken 3 years to get there.
Dare I ask, what the issue was?
Oh, well, the first issue was they forgot to order a 9-metre run of glazing for us, and we had to wait 12 weeks for that. The second issue was that they installed another 9-metre run of glazing in the wrong place and had to move it. And it just went on and on
so
and on.
Once that's happened, then you're sort of dealing back in time.
There were lots of other issues. It wasn't installed as well as it should have been. But in the window company's credit, they have continued with us and they've been to site 1 million times and slowly fixed everything. So everything is resolved the way it should be. And you've got to have a challenge, right, in this kind of thing.
There's always something. On my own windows, we had this defect in the middle of the windows and all the glass had to be replaced. I mean, it's a freak thing in the factory and not actually the fault of the window manufacturer. It's the glazing people, but still. Mm-hmm. I mean, I look at that and just think, oh my goodness, it's something brand new and it will never be as perfect when you start replacing and doing all these things. So it does happen, all these sorts of things. Well, what about the rest of your team? I think that so much of a successful project is the people. So Absolutely. What did you do right there?
We just found the best architect and he's a good man. And he was happy to park his ego about this whole project. He'd never done a passive house before. And, he's an architect. They want to do lots of twiddly things and beautiful things. And that's not always feasible in a passive house project. And he was more than happy to park his architect's ego, listen to the passive house consultant, and do the right thing to achieve a passive house. And he was happy to learn all of this stuff and take it on board. And then he suggested contractors to us that he thought could build to this quality of construction. And we chose one that was kind of like in the middle of the price range. Because he and the architect have worked together before, they had a good relationship. We kept the architect on through the project, and so we were able to talk with the architect who talked with the contractor. We all were able to maintain a good relationship.
And they all listened to the passive house consultant, which is really important.
Yeah.
I've seen the reverse happen where you can see almost the architect tries to distance themselves and the contractor hasn't budgeted correctly. So something is working well in this relationship.
Yeah, we were incredibly fortunate. They were I think partly because they were just all good people. Really good integrity. And we have another friend who's had construction, and it's a woman working by herself, and how contractors treat her as a woman. The guys were just so respectful of me and would listen to me and talk with me, and that was really important. I know I've always got Roman as a backup, but it didn't matter. The way they behaved to me said a lot about who they were, I felt.
Any other challenges or interesting parts of the project that other people might like to know about?
Windows. Windows. I mean, really, what it comes down to, your assumption is that the worst part of any build is going to be the stuff that you kind of knee-jerk, oh my God, this has happened, I've got to rejig this. You don't expect the thing that's built in the factory to be the thing that is the worst nightmare of the whole build. So windows. But funnily enough, the thing that I recall vividly is the window finishes. Now, we're not talking kind of the paint on them or anything like that. It's where the windows meet the wall. It's the kind of thing that you think it's just going to happen. Windows meet walls all over the place. So it must just work. Well, it doesn't just work. You have to design it to work. And we live in a very, very wet environment. We have southwest winds that bring that southwest rain. It hammers against the southern facade and the west side of the building. And so getting really good window to wall seals is really, really important. And I think a big part of the integrity of the building with respect to its thermal envelope. You start to get moisture in there, it's really going to change things like thermal conductivity. It's also going to affect the lifetime of the build. And so getting that window to wall seal right turned out to be really, really important and was an incredibly lucky accident for us. About a week and a half before we had the guys coming in to start to apply render, we realised that nobody had thought about window to wall seals at all. And Nick Grant, our Passive House consultant, had talked about it a bit and said, this is really important. But in the kind of mix of everything else that was going on, the billion questions a day, you deal with what's immediate. And that was nowhere near being immediate. And we were really, really lucky because he'd just been to see somebody else he was working with up in Derbyshire. And he said, you need to talk to somebody who has the parts you maybe need. And he pointed us at this other guy who was a self-builder who just finished his windows and had a lot of spare Baumit pieces that we could use. And he had just enough for us to do the seal between the windows and the walls. And it's so important to get that in place before the renderers arrive, because if you get the right kit, it just fits in perfectly, creates perfect seals. It's just fantastically designed and engineered. And so I drove up to Derbyshire. I bought everything this bloke had, brought it back, and in the weekend before the renderers came, I fitted all the window to wall seals and worked it all out. And I'm so glad that we did that. If that had not been done, it would be a nightmare right now. Just we'd be dealing with silicon in windows all the time, just doing all of that stuff that would make, I think, life miserable. So getting that done was a fabulous and very, very lucky accident. And I can't say enough to anybody who's looking at doing a self-build, think about that very, very early on, because we only fixed it by accident. It was a very, very lucky accident.
So obviously Nick flagged that up, but does that fall under the responsibility of you as clients or architect or builder, or,
It's one of those things I think falls between the two, because you've got lots of situations where one company is dealing with one thing, like the windows, that's the window installer, and the builder's dealing with the envelope. Who deals with where windows meet walls? Who deals with where concrete floor meets windows? If you've got different companies doing that kind of thing, that's where stuff starts to fall between the cracks, quite literally.
I now know what you mean. Now, you mentioned the concrete floor there. Let's just have a word on that, because we're concrete throughout.
We are.
And was that an easy decision to make? Or
Absolutely.
Yeah. So is this a love of yours that you wanted a concrete? Because it does make life a lot easier, and I've heard about the little robot vacuum that you've got going backwards and forwards.
Yeah, we're having lived in California, the concrete floor thing is much more common out there. So we had experienced it, loved it, like very simple, low maintenance living. And we have 2 big grubby dogs. And so, it was an absolute no-brainer for us to put concrete floor in.
And at the end of this all, how has it been to live in? Is it what you expected?
It's so much more than we expected, I think. I mean, obviously we have the beautiful landscape to look out on every day, but even that, the same landscape we've been looking at for years, having it massively expanded with this big glazing has enhanced that. But the environment to live in a passive house, it spoils you. You can't go anywhere else. Just the constant temperature, just the right humidity level. You're always warm, it's comfortable. You can't go to anybody else's house anymore because you're freezing. It's so much more than we expected.
Any other tips for people who are just starting their journey, or things you do differently, anything like that?
Actually, I have one. I think there was one oversight that we made. I mean, there's other oversights too, like the occasional switch in the wrong place. You can't get everything perfect. But I think the one oversight that we made that I think is actually really, really important and isn't highlighted by anyone, and that is the issue of the airflow in the house. You're pulling in outside air. You're relying completely on mechanical ventilation. And as a result, there are basic filters in there to get rid of insects, significant particulates, but it doesn't deal with smells. And I think an important part of any mechanical ventilation system should be the inclusion of a HEPA filter. Now, you may not need it all the time. And so there are ways that you can install HEPA filters where you can just leave the filter out and it just behaves as if it was never there. But when you need it, I think it's something that you can't retrofit. And it's something that I wish we'd included, because we live in an area where people burn.
I was just going to say, have you had a smoke moment?
Yes. Well, actually, I don't know if you need to edit this, but we have a horse shit moment. There are people who burn their horse waste.
Oh, right.
And it can, when the wind's blowing in the wrong direction, it's not really, really bad, but it's not.
What would happen in a normal house? This is what I always wondered. Fair enough if your ventilation system is facing, very close to whatever the smell or the problem is, but in a normal house, would you get this same thing, or just perhaps not? I don't know.
I think you would. In our old house, we used to smell it because there's so much leakage in the house, so the smells would come in too. But this one, because you're so used to being in such a clean environment, and then occasionally you get this pulled in smoke, you think, where on earth has that come from, and why has it come in? But it makes sense, but HEPA filter would sort that out.
The tip I've been given is just to sort of whack down to 1, and apparently the second you smell it, and then you're pretty much, depending on how long you've got to put up with this.
But it turns out, doing things like putting in a HEPA filter is probably about £500 to £1,000. I mean, you're investing in a massive amount in building this house. It's an area where I think it's probably £500 to £1,000 well spent, even if you really, truly never need it.
It sounds like that's something that should be so easy to retrofit, but it's just not.
Space. Yeah, the issue is if you've got space to put it in, and sadly we haven't. I think there is some room to maybe do something on the outside of the house to accommodate it, and where our air comes in is in the back of the house, which you don't particularly see. So we could probably retrofit something there that we'll maybe look at if it does become a really big problem. But I would think that this is actually more of an issue in an urban environment where you've got particulate emissions from exhaust. I mean, hopefully we're headed to a world where this is happening less and less, electric cars, all that kind of thing. But in the medium term, I would think in an urban environment is probably more important than in the rural environment where we live.
Well, again, another one I haven't heard. It's been lovely to have a chat with you. So, Roman, Tracey, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Get more in today's show notes, which you can find at houseplanninghelp.com/276. We always provide you with a summary, so you can go and refer to that, including a few photos from construction, obviously photos of the finished property as well. If you've got a comment or you'd like to ask a question, you can do that within the show notes or on social media. We'll give you the links. houseplanninghelp.com/276. Couple of things to finish up on today. Firstly, a hub update, our air tightness masterclass with Niall Croissant from Ecological Building Systems. That's now in the archive. So he starts with the basics, and you can feel it just going deeper and deeper into intelligent moisture management and intelligent airtight solutions. So he explains all of that. And then his experience, because he's actually gone and done it on his own self-build. So we conclude like that. We got another chapter of my in-depth video case study, because for the last little while we've been adding to that each time. So externally things are about to change because it's the lime rendering that's going on. Duncan Cowper is the man in charge of that. And interestingly, the vast majority of work he does is on historic properties, existing dwellings. And I think it was quite an interesting hire for us because this was just what we wanted. We were clearly building something new, and personally, I wanted it to look new at the end. I don't really see the point of trying to make something look old. But we wanted a nod because Kay was one of the original things, wanted to live in an old house. So we were trying to somehow cross that divide. So I think we've got something that's somewhere in between. It's using the existing materials and just having a few familiar traditional undertones to that. So have a look at the video. It's probably the best way to describe that one. Also, we've got our courses, the private forum, and if you want to chat through your project with me, we have regular calls that you can just dial into. So if you want more information about becoming a Hub member, head to houseplanninghelp.com/join. And finally, well, I know a few of you work in construction, and I suppose my day job really is video production. I run a production company called Regen Media. We like to place ourselves solely in construction and ideally working with ecological builders. So if you've completed a build that you're particularly proud of, make sure you're marketing it properly. Video is a great way to do that, and there are all sorts of different types of video that you can make, but don't just go straight into the next project when you could be getting a lot of mileage from a great project that you've done. So we'll put the link into the show notes for Regen Media. We've made videos for all sorts of people over the years: Green Building Store, Archetype, Passivhaus Trust, Passivhaus Homes. We've done another one for them recently. I love their system. Potten, Nadura, all sorts. The list goes on. So if we can help you make a video, then we'd love to get involved. Next time, Fionn Stevenson is my guest, and we're going to be looking at building performance evaluation. She's written the book, so we'll find out more about that. Thank you so much for being there. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.